Right, let's just get straight into it. Have you ever wondered how your brain actually decides what to pay attention to in an incredibly chaotic world? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unravel a really fascinating cognitive mystery. We're looking at how our brains use a very specific type of error, which is basically the feeling of surprise, to navigate, learn, and ultimately survive in the world around us.
To get us started, I want you to picture this. Imagine you decide to hack your morning alarm clock. When it goes off, it blares its usual annoying sound, but now you've set up a light to flash right alongside it. The question is, would you actually learn anything new from that flashing light? Or would your brain just entirely ignore it because the sound already told you everything you needed to know? Keep that scenario in the back of your mind, because it sits at the absolute heart of how we process information.
To figure this out, we first have to unpack what's known as the blocking effect mystery. To really unravel this puzzle, we have to look back to a groundbreaking discovery from 1969 by a researcher named Leon Kamin. He was studying how animals learn to associate certain cues with certain outcomes, and what he discovered is now famously known as Kamin's blocking effect. He found that if an animal already knows for a fact that a light perfectly predicts the arrival of food, and then you start playing a tone alongside that light, the animal doesn't learn a single thing about the tone. The existing knowledge literally blocks the new information from being absorbed.
You can brilliantly see this illustrated if you look at the top row on this chart, labeled Group Block. We see a cue, labeled A, that's already been trained to predict an outcome. Now, when a brand new cue, X, is introduced alongside it, just look at the test graph on the far right. The learning curve for that new cue, X, is basically zero. It completely flatlines. Because the first cue already predicted the outcome 100%, the brain essentially said, yeah, I've already got this figured out, and completely shut down the learning process for the new stimulus.
So, that brings us to the actual math behind this feeling of surprise. How on earth do we explain this behavioral anomaly where perfectly valid, good information is just completely ignored by the brain? Well, in 1972, researchers Rescorla and Wagner stepped in to solve this. They proposed a mathematical theory that honestly completely revolutionized our understanding of associative learning. They introduced this concept of a common error term. They hypothesized that learning isn't just about two things happening at the exact same time. It's entirely about expectation. This quote, right from their original literature, perfectly summarizes the model. If one CS already fully predicts that the US will come, nothing will be learned about a second CS that accompanies the first. What this translates to in everyday life is that if your brain perfectly predicts the world around you, it actively stops learning. Basically, predictability is the ultimate enemy of acquiring new knowledge.
So the crucial takeaway here is that learning is completely driven by the discrepancy between what actually occurs and what we expected to occur. Now, in cognitive psychology, they call this a prediction error. But let's be real. In plain English, we can just call it surprise. Without surprise, your brain's recording equipment is essentially paused.
And all of this builds into a beautifully simple formula, the Rescorla-Wagner equation. It calculates learning based on that common error term we mentioned. It literally just subtracts what I expected from what actually happened. If there's a massive gap between those two things, you've got high surprise, and boom, you learn quickly. But if there's a zero gap, meaning what happened is exactly what you thought would happen, there's zero surprise, and learning is entirely blocked.
But wait, there's another really interesting piece to this puzzle. Paying attention to the errors themselves.
What if the error isn't just about the final reward or consequence? What if it's about how we process the signals themselves? Enter the Pearce-Hall model in 1980, which looked at this from a totally different angle. While the Rescorla-Wagner model argues that a perfectly predicted consequence loses its effectiveness to drive learning, the Pearce-Hall model focuses on our attention to the actual signal. It suggests our brains are just ruthlessly optimizing for efficiency. If a signal's consequences are perfectly known, your brain literally drops its attention to that cue just to save mental energy.
And this drop in attention explains a phenomenon called latent inhibition. I know, it sounds super fancy, but it basically just means that repeated exposure to a useless cue makes us functionally blind to it later on. If an event happens over and over again with no meaningful consequence, your attention to it drops to absolute zero. If that exact same event later becomes super important, your brain actually struggles to learn about it because it's already filed it away in the brain's ignore folder.
Now, let's take this up a notch and look at higher order conditioning.
What's wild is we can actually take everything we just learned and strip the direct rewards away entirely. This happens when you learn associations without any direct rewards, like food or pain, being present at all.
For example, sensory preconditioning, where you connect two totally neutral cues together. Or think of second-order conditioning. Imagine learning that lightning predicts thunder, and then later learning that thunder predicts a jump scare. Your brain connects the lightning to the jump scare, even though they never happened at the exact same time. Researchers have found that the exact same common error term and prediction errors regulate this high-level abstract learning too.
And we had the data to back this up. Check out these charts from a 1982 study by Bombay's showing that the blocking effect works across entirely different layers of learning. Notice how the black dots representing the block group show significantly different learning curves than the control group. What Bombay's proved here was that a first-order cue, something directly tied to a reward, can completely steal the show and block your brain from learning a second-order cue.
This phenomenon is known as cross-order blocking, and honestly, it tells us something absolutely profound about human and animal cognition. Whether the error is operating at the level of a physical response or just sensory processing of neutral stuff, the brain prioritizes the most established predictor and just blocks out the rest. We are highly efficient, if slightly stubborn, prediction machines.
Which leads us to a pretty big question. Does this classic theory actually hold up today?
Like any great scientific mystery, this is still actively being tested and debated today, so we have to impartially look at where the research stands right now. On one hand, in 2016, researchers led by Mayes published a paper reporting 15 failed experiments trying to replicate the blocking effect. They suggested that historical publication bias might have created false confidence in the original theory. But, on the other hand, researchers like Soto in 2018 strongly defend the associative learning theory. They argue that these modern failures to replicate are easily and completely accounted for by the specific, highly complex types of stimuli used in those new experiments, which they say perfectly align with contemporary learning models. It is a really fascinating debate that just goes to show the science of learning is always evolving.
Ultimately, all of this leaves us with a really powerful question to reflect on. The next time you encounter something totally new right alongside something familiar, ask yourself, is your brain actually paying attention to the whole picture? Or has your engine of surprise simply turned off, leaving you blind to the things you think you already know? Thank you so much for exploring this cognitive mystery with me in this explainer. Keep questioning your predictions, and I'll catch you next time.